I'm JJ Perez from Inside Runner Sports. That's Greg Luca, San Antonio Express News. Live.
How about that?
From the Alamo Dome. Well, it's not live when you guys are watching it, but we're here.
Yeah.
In
We
the
haven't
Alamo
done an
Dome
in-person one this year.
after a huge, massive upset win by the Roadrunners, 44-36. Greg, what a win by UTSA. I didn't think they had it in them, and they proved me wrong.
Yeah, I guess you have to assume anytime they come into the Alamo Dome that it's in play, being that they are now 27-3 here under Jeff Traylor.
4-0 this season.
I think 8 in a row overall, and something like 15 of the last 16 in that neighborhood. So it feels like anytime they come in this building, they have a chance to beat whoever they play. And Memphis was far from perfect today. They've shown some cracks at times this season, and UTSA was positioned to take advantage. I thought the offense looked awesome. Owen McCown had another big game with 4 touchdowns and all the tight ends, and it just felt like they were finding gaps in Memphis' defense and were dialing up some offense. I think Justin Burke seemed like he had a good day of putting the guys in position where they were wide open on a lot of these plays. Jess
Lepp, too, with a solid outing there. It looked early on that this was going to be a track meet, right? Like 24-24, both teams kind of making plays. The chunk plays came out and bit UTSA early. We've seen that kind of all season long, right? But then they kind of bowed up at the end of the first half. 2 fourth-down stops over here, kind of near midfield, and then 7 second-half possessions where they shut out Memphis.
Yeah, so Memphis scored 3 touchdowns and a field goal on their first 4 drives, and then it was, I think, 9 in a row where UTSA was able to stop them. And there was a few turnovers on downs in there, like you mentioned. I mean, UTSA's defensive front has been considered their strength for years now. It feels like with the depth and talent they have up there. And if anything, this year was the first time that it wasn't necessarily 3 deep, or at least not with guys that you knew coming into the year could rely on. We've seen some freshmen and a guy like John Jones come in there and make some plays. So it's been a little bit of a different kind of rotation up front, but those guys still stood up and made those plays when they needed to. And I'd have to watch it back to be sure, but it looked like UTSA started playing a lot of coverage in that stretch. And it was funny because against Tulsa, it felt like that hurt them, right? That those guys weren't able to match up well enough to be able to get stops. And against theoretically a much more talented Memphis team, they were able to lock up on those receivers pretty well. And I think some of those catches Memphis made were pretty contested, and otherwise, it just didn't seem like there was a lot there for him.
There were obviously a lot of injuries in this game defensively, in the defensive backfield. No Ken Robinson, no Zay Frazier. I think Denver Harris was banged up. I don't know if
he was out there some, I'm pretty sure, but I don't recall him making
We saw Cyrus Dumas return. He had some big plays, forced fumble. I think almost interception that was flagged early on. So
Jamarius Lewis came up with the interception, and it was his first start for Ken Robinson. And Ken Robinson has been huge to this team for many years now, and honestly, Jamarius Lewis had not shown all that well up to this point in the season. So for him to make a play like that, I think it really speaks to UTSA's resiliency. And I thought the same thing at tight end, where you lose Oscar Cardenas, who's been the guy at that position for years now, and the other 3 all have monster days. So it's a testament to the Roadrunners, the culture and the resilience and all that stuff they talk about.
I also want to call out a few young guys on defense. Right, we saw Davin Martin play a lot. We saw the Elijah Newell kind of get baptized a little bit, but it's different, right? When
those just good players that he's up against.
And it's different from last week where you get thrown into an in-game situation because you're needed to versus where you have a week to prepare, and they looked, even though they did give up some big yards in the beginning of the game, they did look more prepared and coached up this week than last week, considering all things considered.
Yeah, I really thought that group was pretty sharp, and it just hasn't been, when we've seen them succeed in recent weeks, it's been because they've been able to generate a ton of pressure. And today, it's not like that they had at least a couple sacks in there, and sometimes they would rush 3 or 4, and those guys would at least limit the amount of time that Seth Hennigan had. But it was a different kind of formula to just kind of keep Memphis from. I mean, you mentioned the big plays. I think in the first half or during that stretch where things were going well, they hit 6 or 7 pass plays at 15 or more yards, and then the second half they didn't hit one until the game was out of reach in that final 2 minutes where UTSA had the 3-score lead and almost made it interesting. But
and then the ball that goes off 6 people's hands before the touchdown.
So they ended up with some pretty big yards, but you really just have to look at that middle stretch and how UTSA was able to shut them down, because that was where the game was won.
Yeah, the incredible defensive effort. I think that's what you might have expected coming into we talked about that last week, right? That first half was what you expected, and I think Jamal Ligon, who became the all-time tackles leader today in UTSA history, said it kind of shows that they could be a great defense and a good team.
Yeah, it seemed like the offense having moments of struggles, especially early this season, was more predictable, but the way we saw the defense get abused at times, even as early as the Texas State game, was really surprising, because they had so many returning pieces on that side and guys that UTSA knew they could rely on. and it just hadn't materialized. They had some of the same errors they've had in previous years with the big plays, which has been a thing we've talked about a lot. And it just to see today that they were able to make the adjustments that they need to make to have that be different, where it hasn't always seemed like they were able to do that. I mean, against Tulsa, again, it was the opposite story, where second half of the game, they were not able to adapt to what Tulsa was doing, and it felt like they had an easy time marching down the field whenever they got the ball.
Let's jump to the offensive side of the ball. You mentioned the play of the tight ends, Oscar Cardenas with the season-ending injury last week, only for 4 tight ends to come and score touchdowns, or 4 touchdowns by tight ends, and led by Owen McCown, who played another 4 touchdown game. We saw, David Amador come back for his first, game of the year and throw a nice pass on a gimmick play, except for being able to get the run game going, which it was a struggle, right? But I mean, a really good offensive showing through the air for UTSA today.
Well, this is, I think, a case of UTSA sort of acknowledging that the run game is just not going to be there. And Coach Jeff Traylor talked about that pretty candidly this week.
Yeah.
He was just like, when we need to run the ball, we can't do it. We don't get the push with the offensive line that we need to get. That has pass blocked pretty well at times, but the run blocking has been an issue all year. And so to see them, it's not like they completely abandoned it, but they did what they had to do to establish it to some extent and make that be a threat that Memphis had to be aware of, but then to really do most of the work through the air. I don't know the exact run-pass split, but obviously they were pretty pass-heavy. And from Owen's perspective, it's really interesting because early on in the season, it felt like he was going to be what we saw from Frank Harris a lot of the time, where it's like a lot of short, really high percentage passes. And today was a different kind of game.
Bombs over Baghdad.
Where most of his work was done downfield. And so I think it shows that even at this early stage of his career, he's a guy who can beat teams in a lot of different ways. So that's kind of scary for his future.
I think what I've seen with him the last few games is he's getting quicker with his progressions, it seems like, right? Maybe you got to give credit to that offensive line that I didn't think they'd be able to hold up today against what that was a physical defensive front Memphis had, and they were doing some things kind of tricky to try and trick them up, but they gave him enough time, and even when they didn't, he scrambled out and is surprisingly quick with his wheels.
Yeah, I wonder what the time to throw was, because it did look like a lot of cases his first read that he wanted to go to was there for him. I thought they had times where they were able to hit these plays, like guys in the slot that ended up kind of finding a hole in the zone, and I thought a lot of times they were able to go to that first read and just have it succeed. So it seems like I really do think the offensive play calling just sort of put the guys in an advantageous situation.
Right, and what I noticed too is there's, like, he rolls out, there's multiple guys on one side of the field to throw. So last week we noticed more in the middle of the field thing. So they're doing something offensively to try to make this work without a run game.
I think he has a pretty tough job too, because there were times we would talk to Frank Harris after games, and he would say, "Well, if I see one-on-one, I just throw it up." You have Cephas, and you have Zakarian Clark, and you have Zakari Franklin, and I think we saw today a situation where UTSA had a 4th and short, and they ended up just throwing the slant to Chris Carpenter because they had the one-on-one. But it's not the same kind of deal as those guys with the big frame and who have just been a little bit more productive, more consistently than Chris Carpenter's been through his career. Not to say, he had a great game today. His 2 weeks in a row, he's caught long passes that were huge to this team. But I guess what I'm saying is you can't really do the sort of things that Frank was able to do. Owen has to make a lot of this happen on himself, or they have to scheme guys open in a different way. And so it just sort of adds another layer to how impressive today's showing was.
A lot different when you have Patrick Overmeyer lining up on the end there for the big plays downfield. So
and they didn't. I mean, it wasn't like they hit a ton of big screen passes. Owen earned all of his yards.
4 touchdowns today, 8 total touchdowns the last 2 games, 0 interceptions, 20 touchdowns on the season so far for Owen. Man, ton of potential there.
Yeah, I know there were some people who doubted him early in the season. I don't know that. I mean, he's not perfect. Even today, I bet there was a couple throws that he missed. And
percentage completion was a little low.
But generally, you see a lot of signs of promise, and you see where, if you're making a list of things that you don't like about the offense, he's going to be really far down. I mean, even before this last couple of weeks stretch, and now, if anything, we said last week he was the bright spot, and I think that continues to be true, where you have to feel pretty good about future years when you know you have that position solidified.
Memphis came in here today with hopes of potentially competing for the league title. They leave here today thinking their season's over?
Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, there's obviously some tough competition at the top of the league when you have your Tulane and you have Army, and those are the 2 that come to mind right away. So I do think generally it's going to be an uphill battle for them to try to get back in the mix, but you never really know how things break.
Yep. we saw the Roadrunners kind of break through here for a big win. Like I said, I didn't see it coming. Jeff Traylor kind of explained to us what this win meant to him and the team. What do you think it means?
Well, it was kind of interesting because the crowd was the smallest that's been here
they were loud,
since COVID, and
yep.
but you could see that it was the point. I thought of the point he made during the week of like the 20,000 who are going to show up are the passionate ones, the real fanatics, and you could tell just from the noise that they made. I mean, Memphis had 5 false starts, and sometimes you just make a false start, but there were a couple times where it felt like it was scenarios where the crowd was getting into it and it was causing them problems. So I do think generally that you saw sort of that passion and belief in the fan base still be there strong enough to push these guys forward, and I think we've seen a lot of evidence, and they've never said anything to the contrary, that they're still as engaged and locked in and with their culture and following their process as they've ever been, even if, you know, sometimes there's stuff on the field that looks undisciplined or that makes you say, I don't know that they're all the way locked in on what they need to be locked in on. But, you know, there's plenty of times like this where you see that there's still a lot of signs that they're on the right track.
You look at 3 of those losses the last month, and they are arguably 3 of the worst losses in school history, and it might have been easy to pack it in after any one of those losses, especially last week. That was about as bad as it gets.
And puts you really in a position where it seemed like bowl eligibility was kind of out of reach, and now that's right back in play.
Here they are, back from the dead, and I'm going to put you on the spot here. I'm a big Godfather movie fan, and the guy's like, just when they thought I was out, they dragged me back in. The Roadrunners going to make a bowl game.
Yeah,
Great.
At this point I would say yes, because I think you beat Temple. You should be able to do that. And then it comes down to the North Texas game where at this point it takes something special for me to pick against UTSA at home. It just seems like that's something that they've been able to deliver. And obviously a game with kind of the stakes and the history of North Texas throws some of the variables off a little bit. But I think generally you have to put UTSA in a favorable position because just what they've shown today is a step ahead of what we've seen from them at any other point in the year, aside from maybe, like the first half last week looked a lot like this kind of level of play. But generally this was the first time they put it together for such a long stretch.
I think I said something last week like UTSA's maybe a handful of plays away from 3 more wins this year. I probably really believe they should have won 2 more, right?
Which ones?
Not Rice. I would say East Carolina and Tulsa. They
really, the East Carolina game, you feel that way?
Yeah, yeah. So,
but I understand that they certainly earned the losses.
You're right.
Like just the way it happened and the mistakes that they made. But you can see that minus those mistakes, they are still a pretty good team.
And you see a game like today, very limited. I mean, a first half that had a lot of penalties, right?
Yeah,
but
right. And then
a second half, zero. So against a really good Memphis team, right? And they got to find a way to just keep building on it, right? I'm not going to write off the Army game either. Obviously, that looks like a huge challenge on the road across the country on national television. But this team is just so up and down. Who knows what we're going to see week to week, and I think it was a big win for them just to kind of reinforce that they still have it. And I think that's kind of what we heard from the post game is that it gives them kind of reinforcement.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it wouldn't take much for them to be 6-3, and it would be a pretty flimsy 6-3.
Right.
But they're certainly in the range of having the kind of season that they wanted to have. It's just been too many different mistakes and things we talked about over and over again, and that have let them down. But I think when you see a game like this, that's when you start to understand why people were critical of the coaching so much at times, because they have this in them, and it's just about trying to harness it and get it out of them week to week.
I think I told you today, I think it's fair to see a performance like this as a fan, right, and say, oh man, this makes me even more upset, because why couldn't you play like this last week?
Yeah, and it was funny, I think Jamal Ligon was just like, I don't know why we don't look like this every week, and it's a good point. There's no reason that they couldn't deliver at this kind of a level more often. That's what we expected when we came into the year, and people like yourself were saying it's the deepest and most talented roster we've seen, and there was a lot of faith in every position. I couldn't really find an area that I was concerned with, and then it felt like everything was a problem. So they have the pieces that, even if this year has no shot of becoming anything more than sort of scraping out bowl eligibility and being decent in the annals of things, it does sort of project that we know that the guys on the roster are talented, and if they're all still here, then it could still be a pretty good future.
And not to be remiss about the injury situation, right? I don't think that was an excuse or reason at the beginning of the season.
Now it's pretty undeniable.
I think there's maybe 20 guys, a dozen guys lost for the season, maybe 8 to 10 more banged up that we think we know about, right? William McCoy wasn't here today because of the birth of his child. So just a lot of uncertainty with personnel availability.
Yeah, and it's your single-digit guys too.
Right.
Your Joe Evans and your Torian Clark and your Ken Robinson and your Devin McEwen today, and it's just been a bunch of. I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple too. It's just been a bunch of Joe Evans. I've probably said already, but it's just been a bunch of those guys, like people who you would thought would be central to this team's success. That it all, or it's either a situation where they get hit in the same spot, multiple cornerbacks, multiple receivers, multiple offensive linemen, where those impacts are felt even more because each guy you lose, that next guy up is just not as strong. So yeah, for them to weather that the way they did today against, we talked a lot this week about the value of Memphis's roster monetarily, and the level of talent that they brought in, and for second and third string guys in a lot of cases to hold up against that is really impressive.
Yep, very impressive win. Greg, did we touch on everything? NIL, everything?
I don't want to go down that road. I think we're good.
We're good. Yeah, a big win by the UTSA Roadrunners as they run to 4-0 at home this season. Greg, the Roadrunners remain in contention for bowl eligibility. 3 more games left in this regular season. Who knows what happens?
Have an open week to get a little healthier, and I guess we'll see where that leaves them.
Yep. Well, that'll wrap it up from the Alamo Dome, guys. I'm JJ Perez, Inside Runner Sports. Greg, Luca, San Antonio Express News. Thanks for watching, everyone.